Or okay, so the session's been recording. Okay. Just a little bit of, why are we here today and what brought around this session. So as we talked last June out in Massachusetts, we had really talked about, some of the feedback that came out as we were working on educator shortages. Is the feedback was pretty strong around data and how do we collect data? What's the type of data? And how do we use the data in working from an SEA, but also supporting our LEAs? And so that was a theme that came back from the 6 states that participated, and the same 6 are here today. So we're really excited about that. And so, as we partnered and continue to talk with Region 1, and as Region 1 and Region 2 continue to talk, we put together a series of these 3 sessions. You can move to the next slide, Jessica. In terms of really supporting the work, and just a little background of who we are again. We all know our Region 1, Region 2 is our part of our federally funded centers, and our work is to support SEAs through technical assistance on areas that are identified as needs. And so one of these needs are, really thinking about strengthening our educator workforce. And so we put together some ideas, and definitely at the end of this session, we'll be asking for feedback in terms of guiding our session 2 and session 3. So when we think about session, today is really think about, what's the data that we're looking at? What data should we be collecting? And if you are, that's great. It affirms some of the work that you're doing. If there's areas that you can, increase your knowledge base and so on, those are some things that we're going to share, some resources and some tools that will help you identify as an SEA, what are some other sources that I may not be using. In session 2, we're going to dig into, okay, how do we use that data to really inform the work that we do in our workforce? And session 3 is now, how do we really leverage that educator workforce data to inform policies and procedures to support your LEAs? And so our objectives today are to engage in discussions. You will have opportunity to go into breakout sessions. Our first breakout session is an opportunity to network. So we'll randomly assign you so that you can talk across states. You're going to learn from Colorado some of the work that they've been doing and how they've been gathering their data to really identify their supply and demand. What are some of the things that they can do to really inform their educator workforce? And then we're going to share some tools as ways to really help you really, again, strengthen that educator workforce data. And I'm going to turn it over to Kate.
Thanks so much, Amal. Hi, everyone. Caitlin Beatson. As Amal said, I'm a Deputy Director in the Region 2 Comprehensive Center. Great to see so many of you that we got to see in person last June. And welcome to those that were not at the last June convening. Great to have you here today. I'm just really going to spend a few minutes kind of kicking us off, orienting us to the conversation around identifying data to strengthen the educator workforce. When we began this work together, we really kind of focused on addressing educator shortages. And that was sort of the title of our convening last June. And this was flagged by all of our states across the Northeast as being a primary area of concern, and particularly post-COVID. But as many of us know that have worked in this space for a long time, this is not necessarily a new issue, unfortunately. But something that came up when we were together was this sort of question about what a shortage is. Do we have a shortage? How do we define a shortage? So just wanted to share a couple of things again to sort of get our conversation started today. These are headlines from major media outlets, from CNN to Fox News to The Economist. This issue of educator shortage has dominated headlines for months, as many of you know. And again, I'm sure you've seen these, read these, and looked at them even prior to where we are now, prior to COVID, et cetera. Just take a moment to read through this selection of headlines here. All right. So interestingly, or maybe not surprisingly at all, but these are all from a single 2-week period in August alone. So since that point, there have been many more headlines and stories published on this issue. And as you can see, some of these are pretty contradictory. They don't necessarily say the same thing. And also, interestingly, a couple of these were actually published on the very same date and seem to tell a very different story or lead into a very different story. But really what we want to do today is kind of get past these headlines into the nuance and what we know to be the much more sort of complicated issue of educator shortage and really generally challenges with and opportunities within the educator workforce. So one issue that we believe complicates this matter and may be contributing to these kinds of contradictory headlines is this lack of a common definition of educator teacher shortage. That's across districts, across states, and even the nation. So we wanted to do just kind of a quick test of this hypothesis. This came up a little bit when we were together in June, but just wanted to see, how does your state answer this question? How does your state define educator shortage? So Amal, are you going to put the Padlet link in chat? Perfect. So Amal just added a Padlet link in the chat. If you wouldn't mind going there and taking a moment, you'll see your state is listed and adding a comment to share how your state defines educator shortage. Once you've responded, feel free to take a look at what some of the colleagues from other states are saying as well. All right, take about 30 more seconds if you haven't responded. All right, let's open it up to the room. So feel free to come off mute or go ahead and add to chat. What are your reactions just based on what you see across the 6 states here? What are your reactions?
I do find it interesting that many of us don't have a formal definition to be able to, or criteria to be able to say what exactly it is. We're also here in Rhode Island curious about the USED methodology.
I think it's also interesting where everybody's a little different, how in the, in the popular media, we talk about teacher shortage. What are we actually talking about? Because everybody defines it a little differently, from superintendents to SEAs and so forth. So
I tend to think about headlines from the lens of who does this story serve? So who does it serve to promote that schools are chronically understaffed across the board and that nobody wants to teach? I don't know the answer to that, but that's just a general wondering.
Any other reactions? Okay, thanks so much. And we'll save those and share those out at the end as well. So in kind of returning to the group here, again, it seems like these responses sort of prove our hypothesis, right? That it's difficult to know what to make of these headlines, and it's easy to see how they can contradict one another, given that really seems like we don't all operate under the same definition of educator shortage or teacher shortage. But as state education agencies, part of our charge is to support in the ways that are within our locus of control the educator workforce and strengthening the educator workforce, whether that means addressing shortages specifically, maybe in a particular subject area or geographic area, or whether it means more generally, where are there opportunities that we can, sort of make gains and promote something to strengthen the educator workforce, not necessarily specific to a shortage. So, at the state level, there are multiple potential strategies to solve or at least help mitigate the effects of a teacher shortage. So I'll share some recent headlines on this front. Some include, can mid-career teacher programs help cover the shortage? Teacher shortage pushes schools to 4-day schedule. Biden administration partnering with job search companies to help fill teacher shortages. And this one was my favorite. Can robots fill the teacher shortage? So if you recall from our June convening, and I know some weren't there, but one of the things that we talked about was determining which strategies will work best to, whether it's address specific shortages or strengthen the educator workforce, or that will have the greatest potential to work best based on research and evidence that we have, requires that we first clearly articulate the problem. So for those who were my logic model lovers from the summer session, I'm so glad you're back. And for those that are not yet loving logic models, hopefully we can get you there. But if you remember, that very first piece of the logic model is the problem statement. So identifying what is the issue that we're actually trying to address and clearly defining, articulating that issue. And in doing so, you might even find that problem, quote unquote, to address may really present more of an opportunity than a challenge. It's more kind of defining the context, the current state, right? So we can go to the next slide. And this is the last headline I'll share. We fixed our school's teacher shortage. If you take a moment to read this, you'll probably realize pretty quickly that this story is meant to be a joke. It's from the New Yorker's Daily Shouts, which, quote, provide a regular dose of humor, satire, and funny observations. But in all seriousness, today, and Katie, I'm so glad you framed it this way, we're going to push past these headlines. The headlines are not necessarily, telling the particular story within our context. We don't know what purpose or group of people that they're serving per se. We're pushing past these headlines, highlighting data sources that are most helpful for really defining the teacher shortage problem, or more generally elucidating that current state of the teacher workforce or educator workforce in your states. And then we're going to also share how one state is using those data to inform decisions about the strategies that they're using to address educator workforce opportunities and challenges. So this was just to sort of frame our conversation for today. Again, highlight one of the kind of key issues here being we don't even operate under a common definition of educator shortage. We don't even necessarily, given that, know whether we have this widespread educator shortage, whether it's contextual, specific to subject areas, et cetera. But really what matters most is that we understand what data should we be looking at to just really provide us this view of our current educator workforce. What is the current state that we're operating with in terms of our educator workforce? So with that, I will turn it over to Jessica, who's going to get into identifying data sources.
Hi, yes, it's Jessica. Nice to see everyone. I'm Jessica Giffen. I'm the Deputy Director for the Region 1 Comprehensive Center. And I'll just be building on a little bit what Kate has previewed for us and hopefully setting us up for Carolyn's presentation. So yeah, shortages in the news, but really we want to think about collecting data to really understand our entire educator workforce system. And so it's not just focusing on shortages, but what are the potential challenges or opportunities across the system so that it's much more systemic, much more long-term to really understand our workforce. And so some of the reasons why you want to collect the data can help you not only understand what shortages, but really determining, are they specific by subject area, geographic? Are there opportunities? Do you have resources nearby that you're not potentially leveraging to fill a need within your workforce system? So let's say there's a community college nearby that could be a great resource to build a grow your own program in a specific targeted area and region. It helps you really figure out what is the appropriate strategy or solution, and then targeting that to the right place. Because many of these strategies, it's not a one size fits all, but you may require a couple of strategies that are specific to certain contexts or in certain places. You could use this data to really unpack where along that pipeline are areas that have some need. Is it in the attract? Is it retaining? Is there something going on between certifications? So really understanding along that continuum, where do we need to strengthen? Where are we starting to see that drop off in our supply of teachers? Figuring out if there's misalignment and how you might strengthen that between your supply and demand needs. It could vary from place, right? Like some communities really need math teachers, some more special education. So kind of figuring out, do you have that supply that matches the demand? Also thinking about equity. Do we have equitable access to quality teachers everywhere? So making some comparisons. You may have a supply of teachers, but it may not be equitable. And then thinking about where do we want to prioritize to diversify our educator workforce? Ideally everywhere, but as a policymaker, where do you want to prioritize? And so various data sources can help us kind of unpack some of these questions or things that we want to be able to know the current status of, and then improve and strengthen our educator workforce system. So we're going to have an opportunity in breakouts to really reflect on what are those key questions that you as an SCA want to be able to answer in order to better understand the status of your workforce system and improve it. So what kind of questions do you want to be able to answer with your educator workforce data? So it might be some of the examples I shared earlier, but what are those specific questions you want to be able to answer? And then what data do you need in order to answer that question? So this could be, wish list, not limited to what data you currently collect, but just think about, if you had unlimited resources, what are all the questions you would want to know? And what kind of data would you need to collect to answer that question? So we're going to move into breakouts. They're going to be a bit random. So we're going to mix up and have states together. So you'll have some cross sharing. Someone from either Region 1 or Region 2 will be in each of your breakout rooms. We're going to have a Google Doc, and each breakout room will have a table in that first Google Doc. We'll use that as our note taking. So the folks from Region 1, Region 2 will be in charge of the note taking, so you all can focus on the discussing. And we'll spend about 8 to 10 minutes in our breakout, depending on how we're doing on time. Any questions on our activity? Okay, so we put the link to the Google Doc that we'll be using to take notes in our breakouts. And if there's no questions, we'll go ahead and open our breakouts. All right, welcome back. I hope that was a good reflection exercise to think about all the variety of kinds of questions you might want to be able to explore to better understand your workforce and the kinds of data you might need to really unpack that. I love it. Just like 1 or 2 folks want to share kind of a key question that maybe they didn't think about before and a data source that they would need to understand that. You can put that in the chat, or if you want to come off mute. So example of a question that you wanted to be able to answer with your educator workforce data.
I had a question, which was, how do we do all of the things in our continuum, which is attract, recruit, hire, support, retain? And if I focus in on the attraction piece, I think data specifically from middle schools and high schools that feeds into one source directly to our Department of Ed, identifying students who are interested in teaching so that we can route supports, grow your own pathways, or even use that data to substantiate different things in our CTE pathways. I think that would be helpful.
Great, thanks, Katie. Yeah, so a data that's maybe a little different way to look at the supply than just beyond who's enrolled in the EPP programs, but looking even earlier to maybe see who are those folks as early as middle and high school that are in our teaching CT pathways, and what can we do to support them to keep their interest and excitement and kind of get a window into who might be coming into the prep program. So starting that pipeline and supply even earlier. Great. Any other interesting questions or data sources that folks brainstorm together they want to share?
I think just collecting on an annual basis across the districts, what specific content areas or endorsements, and are they do they have vacancies for each year, and what ones remain unfilled, but just getting down into the specifics around endorsement areas and to get a picture across the state where the needs are and what the patterns of those needs are. So being able to collect that on an annual basis from districts.
Great. So getting disaggregated enough to see what are the needs both from subject or endorsement area as well as geographic, because they may vary from community to community. Great. So we did a little backwards mapping where we had you reflect, but we did create a resource as a tool that we're going to put in the chat box. So it's basically a fleshed out version of what you all did. So this handout, we've categorized some key questions to understand your educator workforce system. And each of those categories include kind of a big question in bold, but as well as some other sub questions that kind of further disaggregate it. And then in the last column has the different data sources and how you might want to disaggregate it. So this is just a resource, and we'll have some time at the end to kind of reflect on which of these data sources and questions you're interested in at your SCA. But it's just intended to be comprehensive. It's you probably brainstorm some other data sources and questions. And it does include some aspirational data sources. So there may be things that other places aren't currently collecting, but it's a nice kind of landscape to see the kinds of things we might want to understand about our educator workforce system and the types of data sources you would want to consider collecting in order to answer those questions. So this is a tool for you all to use. Love to hear after you get to spend some time on it if there are other questions or data sources you think we should add to it, but wanted to share this as a resource for you all. And I believe, yes, the link to it is on the chat box, and we'll eventually post this on our websites as well, but you all get kind of early access to this tool. Well, now it's my great pleasure to then introduce Carolyn Hogg from the Colorado Department of Education. I've had the pleasure of working closely with her on developing a geographic information system apps. And so I've had a peek in her data. And so I know she has great processes and systems for identifying the data and collecting it. And so really excited to have her join us today to share a little bit about, kind of behind what's going on and get a perspective from another SCA on how to do this work. So Carolyn, welcome.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm glad to be here. It's nice to see all of you. And I was reading as you were typing in your Google Doc, the kinds of questions, the things you wonder about related to your educator workforce. And honestly, even despite the progress that Colorado's made so far, we still have some of those wonderings as well. So I think it's just an ongoing project to try to get your arms around the workforce. So we do have some slides here. Jessica had asked me if I could talk to you all a little bit about some of the data that Colorado's collected, how we use it, and how we got to the point of actually being able to collect that data. So I believe Jessica was going to run the slideshow, or maybe it was Amal.
I'll take care. Oh, there she goes. She got it.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Jessica. So Colorado is a local control state, and I don't know how many of your states are local control, but that means that the State Department really can't just tell the school districts that we want data, and they would not naturally necessarily comply. And so we needed to get, so for Colorado to get some of the data we have, it required us to obtain the authority to collect the data. Once we had the authority, we had to develop processes to implement the data collection. And in order to build a lot of our data tools, we actually had to leverage as many opportunities as we could. And I'm going to dive into these three areas a little more in the coming slides. So you can go ahead, Amal. Thank you. So over the past 15 years, Colorado has really implemented a lot of education that, legislation that has allowed us to really shine a spotlight on the educator workforce. So on this slide, I've listed some of the primary pieces of legislation that impacted our ability to produce some workforce tools. So we needed legislation to develop unique statewide educator identifiers, which we now do have. So it's a replacement for a Social Security number, and many districts treat it with a very high level of confidentiality. So that was one piece of legislation. We needed the authority to collect educator shortage information. So that was passed in 2017, I believe. We needed legislation to collect the candidate enrollment and completion records from our educator preparation programs. So this is a project that had been going on with our traditional programs, with our institutes of higher ed. This had already been going on for several years, but it had not been going on with our alternative programs. And we needed legislation to allow us to collect that data from our alternative programs. We needed the evaluation data for our educators. which is a system that we built about 10 years ago. So we have been collecting that data for several years. And then the last thing that I'm going to talk about today is we have a statewide school climate and culture survey. And it's nice because it allows you to compare across the state what's going on in terms of leadership at the school level, and what the general climate is within the schools. The problem with it is it's voluntary, and so we often don't have data for many schools. We won't report it if a school has less than 50% participation. And so because it is voluntary, in many areas, we don't have data. But that gives you an idea of the kinds of legislation that we needed to pass in our state. So you can go ahead, Amal, if you'd like. Thank you. So once the laws were in place, then the department needed to really operationalize them. So we essentially needed to make sure that we had the data so that we could start to use it to inform the workforce issues. So there were a lot of data collection processes that needed to be implemented. We needed to get a handle on district hiring needs, preparation program, enrollment and graduation by endorsement area, and at an individually identifiable level. And I'll talk a little more about why it was so important that we would be able to identify everyone. We needed to start analyzing mobility data, mobility retention and attrition data. As I said, we had educator evaluation ratings, and then we had the school climate and culture survey. So we also draw on other data sources. We draw on data from the economic sector via a survey that the US Census Bureau runs. So every 5 years, they have something they call the American Community Survey. And so we get data, economic data from that. So implementing the legislation, but together with the growing availability of data visualization tools like Tableau, this has really impacted what we now know about the educator workforce. We can go ahead, Amal.
Carolyn, we did get one question before we move on. What are the statewide educator identifiers? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the first time an educator gets hired in a school district in the state, well, I should say anytime an educator gets hired, the hiring authority checks the statewide database to see if that person already has an identifier. So they look them up using their social security number. If they don't already have an identifier, they get one. So the hiring district enters their social security number and gets a unique identifier for them. That then is how data are submitted on that individual moving forward. And so you get it using your social security number, but then your social is not used from that point forward. We then rely on the unique identifier. So I hope that answers the question. Yeah, I see the question about seeing the policy that was put in place in Colorado. Is that with regard to the unique identifiers? I think that was Katie's question.
Oh, could you go back one slide, Jessica? All right, so here it says authority through legislation, the educator shortage information. I'd like to see like whatever the regulation or policy language that was used there, because if we wanted to put something in place or recommend something like that, I'd like to see an example.
Okay, yeah, and I'd be happy to get that for you after the session.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, happy to get any legislation that folks would find helpful. Okay, so talking about leveraging opportunities, we actually needed to rely and maximize the extent to which were using the data the department already had. And we discovered that actually the department had some rich data sources, in particular our human resources data. This is a file that had been collected going decades back, and it actually tracks where everybody is working every year, and it includes a lot of information about them. And it's all human resources. It's not just educators, it's the lunchroom staff, it's everybody. But within this vast data set, you can find a lot of information about your educators' mobility, attrition, and retention by linking it year after year. And that had really never been done. So we were able to leverage that data set. We were also able to administer our educator shortage survey by leveraging, again, that data collection, because it was a required and still is a required data collection that districts have been in the habit of providing for decades. We basically joined the educator shortage survey as a requirement to the human resources data set, and said you can't sign off on your HR file until you've completed this survey. And then lastly, the last thing I'm going to talk about here is that we also rely extensively on help we get from federally supported agencies like our Region Comprehensive Center. So we're Region 12. And so the Region 12 Comprehensive Center has helped us tremendously. And we also get a tremendous amount of support from the our regional education lab. So we're the REL Central, and we get a lot of help from them. Okay, thank you. So let me dive into talking a little bit about actually collecting some of this data. And I'm going to try and be cognizant of the time. So we needed to, we break this down and we think about this as having supply side data and demand side data. So on the supply side, think about your educator prep programs and their enrollment and their completions. We have EPPs, both traditional and alternative, submit their enrollment and completion data every year. Now, like I said before, for the alternative programs, that didn't exist until very recently, but it now does. We collect individual records by endorsement area. So we're not just looking at total counts, we're actually asking for individual records and in what endorsement area are they completing. We differentiate between new teachers and those going back for an additional endorsement. Historically, the purpose of this collection was just to report the number of completers in each area. And really, other than to sort of monitor trends, not much was done with it. But the current purpose is we now take these individual records and we track these new teachers into the workforce, and we monitor their licensure test pass rate, their job performance in terms of evaluation ratings, and their retention. So we have an entirely expanded purpose for that data set. On the supply side, still on the supply side, some of the lessons we learned were that EPP leaders, EPP leaders were nervous about the development of a report that would track their completers into the workforce, because it was the first time their completers really had been tracked into the workforce and they didn't know what we would find. So we work really closely with the stakeholder advisory group with both our university programs and our alt licensure programs. Because the data, when they were initially released, was rather positive, it really alleviated their fears. So we did a pre-release window where they could look at their own data, knowing that we were going to release it because by law we were required to. They did have a window of time to preview their data, and that really helped alleviate their fears. I think obtaining timely data is our biggest challenge right now. So for example, we're going to report on a cohort of completers that finished their preparation program in the 2021 school year when we release new data this coming December. So December 22, we're not releasing 21-22 data, we're releasing 2021 data. And that's just due to when the prep programs report their data. Okay, I think we can probably go to the next slide.
Got another question for you. So someone asked, would love to know how EPPs track sort of new candidates versus candidates who are getting an additional certificate.
Oh, so from the prep program's perspective, they normally would, well, in my experience, so I come from a prep program, and in my experience, they are coded that way in the university's student enrollment system. They're actually like enrolled in the added endorsement program or the initial licensure program. So at least that's my experience. I don't know if it works that way in your state, but in Colorado, it does work that way. So it's fairly easy for them. Okay. And then you'll see at the bottom of these slides, we have the URLs for some of our data tools, but we also have a slide at the end that consolidates all these URLs into a single slide, if that's easier for you. And we purposely chose not to dive into the data tools today, but because of time. But if you have any questions, if you get into them and you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. My contact information is on the front slide, which I think Jessica is going to share with you, or maybe she already did. Okay, so when we think about now shifting over to the demand side, and I've mentioned this HR, the Human Resources Employment File, and basically districts have to submit it every year. And once we analyze it year after year, it generates our turnover and retention data. And this is how we find out where our prep program completers, where they're working and how long they stay. So we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So another indicator of demand is then our educator shortage survey, which is really a very simple survey. We administer it annually. Like I said, we make it mandatory because we tie it to their human resource submission. It is really, you can think of it as a matrix, and it lists in the first column every endorsement area. So it's long because it lists every endorsement area. If it asks 7 questions, and they're listed above this, so it's really clear what people would need to answer. But what are the total positions in terms of FTE that you needed to hire for this year. And for example, in that first row would be in agriculture and natural resources. So if they needed to hire one person in that area this year in that district, they would just put a 1.0 in there. Question 2, vacant positions in FTE at the beginning of the school year. So how many were still vacant? Number 3, did you fill a position with a long-term sub? So these are the things that Colorado would consider shortage mechanisms. Long-term subs. Question 4 is retired educators. Question 5 would be alternative licensure candidates still in their program. So not people who've completed an alt program, but they're in it. Emergency licensure candidates. So those are our 4 shortage mechanism routes for filling positions. And then question 7 is how many positions remained unfilled? So if you never filled that ag position, you would put that 1.0 in the last column. So that's how we collect the data. And it truly is just a pretty straightforward, simple survey. So this data is very, very widely used, as you can imagine. We have loans tied, a student loan forgiveness tied to it, grant eligibility tied to it, stipend eligibility, you name it. We use the federal teacher shortage survey guidelines to determine our shortage list. So we use this data to complete the federal shortage survey report. And that list then becomes Colorado's shortage areas. So last school year, we were able to document that of the open teaching positions, so not of all teaching positions, but of open teaching positions, 20% of them were filled by a shortage mechanism. 8% of those open positions were not filled at all. And that's just talking about the teaching positions. We also collect data on our special service providers, excuse me, so school psychs, school counselors, et cetera. And we collect data on principal positions as well.
And we got 2 questions. First, when is this data collected?
So it opens when our human resource collection opens, and it closes with that collection too. And that is late November. It opens and it closes in February. So we collect this year's data. We will open that collection in November. And the second question.
Yeah, so beyond monitoring, what are some other actions your agency has taken using this data, especially if the data seems to be concerning or there's an outlier, just conscious of, how do states act on this data?
So we actually at the Colorado Department of Education have recently received funding to have educator recruitment and retention specialists. So we have 4 FTE that have been hired, and their job is to work with districts on recruitment and retention issues. So they are some of our primary users of this data, and they will actually reach out to districts. They just assigned a region of the state. So they happen to all be either retired superintendents or retired human resource directors. So they're well connected. And so within their region, they reach out to these districts and they try to figure out how to help them resolve the issues that they're facing. And sometimes that involves connecting them to perhaps alternative licensure programs in the area. who might be able to help fill some needs or universities in the area. Sorry. So yeah, so these are just your URLs. You can actually find a PDF of the survey, which is posted online. You can get a summary of the overall project, or you can actually just access the interactive dashboard where we present the data. Okay, so moving on to the educator evaluation data. So this is critical performance data. So the district submits it every year, and it's wonderful because, again, we've leveraged that human resource collection, and we literally embed those fields that we need on evaluation data. We embed them as fields in that file. So they get collected along with all the other human resource data. So moving forward, based on legislation that just passed this past year, we will be developing this as a standalone collection. So the educator evaluation data will be collected separate from the human resource file, which is good and bad. It will still be mandatory, but the reporting of it doesn't have the history and the sort of the weight of the human resource file behind it. So in the first year, it may be challenging, it may not. Well, we will know come spring. And so there's a link here to how we report that data in standalone metrics. We have 4 publicly reported metrics, and then we have an additional 4 metrics that we report on a site that's only accessible to school superintendents or their delegates. I would say that, again, our biggest challenge is getting timely data, and I'm not sure that our evaluation data gets as much traffic, if you will, as some of our other data, because by the time it's actually available to the department and published in these metrics, it's a little bit old. So I think we can move on to the next slide. So then, kind of bringing everything all together, we have a GIS maps project, Geographical Information System maps project, or you might call them heat maps. And this is the project that we work on with our Region 12 Comp Center. And this project brings together all of the data I've talked about so far. Plus, it also pulls in the statewide school climate and culture survey that I spoke about earlier, and the economic data from the Census Bureau. So we can go to the next slide. Here's a screenshot of, and I know it's small, but I encourage you to actually go to the site and explore these maps. This is a screenshot. This project is organized into 8 tabs, and there's a specific question driving the contents of each tab. And there's always a legend over on the far right side. And sometimes, because there's so much data on a particular map, you'll not only have a legend, but you'll have a detailed legend. There's footnotes. You can click on a district in these maps, and that district's data will display. So this is a really rich source of information that literally pulls together everything I've talked about so far, with the exception of the evaluation data. So we don't have that in the maps, but everything else that I've talked about so far, and then some, are embedded in this, this project here. So this has been a project that has come online Well, it came online pretty quickly. I think it was kind of a silver lining to the pandemic, really. We literally started this project the week before the pandemic hit. And we worked on it. That's what we worked on during the pandemic. We worked on this project. We brought it online, Jessica, maybe a year and a half ago. I want to say it's already been a year and a half.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, at least a year, if not 2 years.
Okay. Yeah. So it came online fairly quickly, but that I think was because we already had all the data we needed to run the maps. Through all this other data we were collecting, we didn't have to actually stop and collect new data. The only data that those maps needed that the department didn't already have was the data that came from the Census Bureau. So, and here are more URLs. So we can probably move even to the next slide. Thank you, Amal. So here's some questions, some reflective questions, because depending on where you're at and how long you've been there, you may or may not already know all of this. But the first thing that you might want to reflect on is, what data do you have that is currently available? And is it how's it disaggregated? Is it disaggregated by school district, by endorsement area? You know, we know the teacher labor market is highly localized and regional. We also know that there are differences in degrees of need across certification areas. And so your first step is probably to really spend some time figuring out like what you already have and how you might maximize that, the use of that. Or for example, if you already have a collection around preparation, but it doesn't include endorsement area, you know, how could you tweak a current collection that you already have running to just add endorsement area or give you some other key piece of information that you might be missing? And then the second question that comes to my mind anyway is, what data does the state already make publicly available? So what other data could you get from public sources? And how could you maximize the use of that? And then the last question that I have here is, how can you make the data accessible and actionable? I mean, perhaps your state already collects a lot of data, but is lacking the capacity to make it accessible. We have found that turning Excel files into dashboards is very user-friendly. We get a lot of positive feedback from folks who are using our and we're building everything out in Tableau except the GIS maps. But the rest of what we're doing in the department, we're building it in Tableau. And we get very positive feedback from that. And it's so much easier to interpret masses of data visually than it is to draw that same meaning out of Excel spreadsheets. And I encourage you to continue working with your regional comprehensive center, reach out to your regional education lab, think about other possible partners in your work wherever you can.
Great, thanks, Carolyn. Appreciate the plug at the end there, of course. Any final questions for Carolyn before we wrap our final activities up here? Okay, well, thank you again, Carolyn, for just sharing all the different data sources you've been collecting, kind of the steps needed for it. And again, we'll share the slides and the materials, so everyone will have access to those links. You can take a peek at all of the resources from Colorado. And I will follow up about that legislation language and share that out with folks as well. So again, thank you so much, Carolyn, for taking the time to share and give us an insight on all the work that you've been doing in Colorado.
No, thank you. Thank you for letting us share what we've done, what we've learned, and you know, I learned from what you put in your Google Doc here today too, because there are some of those questions that we still don't have the answer to. Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to turn it back to Amal to wrap us up for today.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks again, Carolyn, for all the information that was shared. And so we have about 10 minutes left, and we really want to provide you with some time to share within your state teams and really think about what you heard, what are some things. And we did send the slides this morning. So if you want to access those links while you're in discussions, feel free to do that. And so what you want to do is take some time right now. We have you set up in breakout rooms that are specific to your state. I know some of you are Lone Rangers right now because I know some folks have to fall off for other meetings, but we also do have you assigned your regional comprehensive center contact who's working with you on this work is actually assigned in your groups. And so that you can have opportunity to kind of just brainstorm, think about, you know, those data sources that you currently have or things that you may want to add or change or just next steps for your SEA. So we're going to give you about, I'll say, let's say 6-7 minutes, and then we'll come back for our last piece, which is some feedback. Okay, so here's the document for our regional folks to make sure you're capturing. Let me just drop that in again. It's the same document. And so you can capture some of the notes so that you all can kind of take it away. And then you should all be assigned by state. And I will send you off. So you have about 7 minutes. Hey, welcome back, everyone. I know this is probably the time you wanted more time to keep talking. As I was reading some of your comments, you know, we encourage you to continue the conversations back with your SEAs as you work through some of the things that you come up with, questions or just kind of next steps. You know, and we, you know, invite you and look forward to seeing you coming back in session 2, where we're going to really focus around how to use that data to strengthen the educator workforce. And then session 3 sometime in March as we think about, you know, how can we inform policy and practices and procedures. So one of the things that we are would like to get some feedback from you all so that it could help, again, inform, you know, what worked, what didn't work. You'll see some of the questions in there and inform our next sessions. So I'm going to drop that in the chat so you can take a few minutes to do that. And, you know, any last questions or comments from anyone in the group, we can actually take the stop sharing screen so we can see faces. If anyone has any questions for the group or for any of us.
No questions, but it was thought-provoking, so thank you.
Great.
Yeah, I agree, Katie. It was helpful, really helpful to have Carolyn here and to just really talk through Colorado's journey and then the rationale behind each of their steps. And then how they leverage their data and how it informs. So that was really helpful.
Good, thank you. Yes, if you can kind of give us some more like things that you would like to see in session 2. Kate, is there opportunity for that in the survey?
I don't think specifically, but in the part where we ask about like what could make the session better, even you can pop it there as well.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you joining us, and we will definitely send out the materials again and the recorded session. So I know some folks have to hop off for other meetings so that they can kind of hear the rest of the messages. Great. Thank you. For the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.